Hi guys, it's Ruben from NoProbes here, and it's time for the third and final sprint. For this sprint, the aim was to finalize the art style and polish the game in preparation for the presentation with Mediatonic at the end of the sprint. One of the first things I had to do during the sprint was lock down the art style I wanted to achieve. With the limitations of my skills, it has to be something achievable. When looking for a direction, I decided to look into games I had been playing recently and have always been inspired by. I've always liked N64 games in both the art style and gameplay. I thought this was something that I can achieve with relative ease, while also being something unique and not oversaturated in the market. I wanted to use as many of the specifications and limitations as I could, things such as texture atlases and low poly models, while also opening myself up in other aspects, such as the amount of polys in a level at one time. One of the big things I limited myself with was to use a texture atlas. This is an atlas filled with low-res textures on one large sheet that is then used across the whole project. This was used back in the day to save on calls from the console on the number of materials. While this isn't necessary with modern technology, I enjoyed the challenge. When making the texture atlas, it was crucial to make sure the saturation was pushed to near extreme levels. This was due to using Banjo-Kazooie as inspiration. I felt that the more saturated and vibrant textures were a product of the time and it would fit well. The second thing that made a big part of the overall look of the game was the use of anti-aliasing. The N64 had heavy anti-aliasing always in use. This was what gave the game's textures the iconic blurred look. I wanted to recreate this, however in the case of modern tech, it was a case of turning down the power of anti-aliasing to something far more similar to the time period. With those two now complete, the last thing to bring these two features together was going to be the post-processing materials. The first material I used was to pixelate the game, emulating the older TVs and monitors. The other two important materials were first creating a fisheye effect with some noise and a slight color correction with graphical errors. This was more to push the narrative idea of the game than actually matching the N64 aesthetic, however all in combination it created a solid and cohesive look. Lighting was also something that could easily ruin the overall game looks and feels. Due to the limited hardware on N64s, there was no real-time lighting options, so most shadows were simulated in other ways. I didn't have the time to simulate these, but I did work out a way when working with the texture atlas to make sure that everything was unlit. This got rid of the need for any light sources and eliminated the need for modern lights. The start of the sprint was also geared towards the level, firstly creating many models to fill out the world. This included many different models, the two main being the farmhouse and the big red barn. There were many other models I made just to fill out the world and create variations. You can see them now. The techniques I used to create the models were mainly using low poly blocks and slowly building up the models, more akin to building with something like Lego over other additive and subtractive modeling methods. The majority of the models were relatively simple to create once I had the work pipeline sorted. I then moved on to the level design, creating something open so the player could move around but it still looked creative, making use of multiple of the same model. One big thing was to make sure that the player felt like they were in a bigger world than they actually were. I used multiple models to hide any edges of the map and had a large tree line covering the exterior of the map. Then, moving on to the coding side of the sprint, I wanted to polish up some things that I had set up in a previous sprint, that being the UI, sound design and animations. For the animations, I used Mixamo and retargeted the skeletons to match the imported ones. I then created unique animation blueprints for each of the enemies. I included walking, running, idle, attacking and death animations. This ended up covering most enemies. Lastly, for the UFO enemies, I wanted to indicate their attacks. For this, I used the help of YouTube to create a simple emitter and send it to the location. When it came to the sound, I also added sound to the enemies just to make sure that the player could get a sense of tension from hearing them chirping in the distance. I also added loud, eerie noises that come from the UFO and boss. This really helped to up the tension. I used the sound of Betsy to help indicate to the player when she was under attack, having a unique sound for when she got hit and when enemies got closer to her. The most important part of the sound was the music design. Using high-tempo psychedelic techno music during combat, the player really felt the sense of danger and it helped them to home in on what they were doing. I used a number of different tracks that the code selected at random. Then during the downtime between waves, using fade in and fade out, I calmed the music down so the player had a few minutes to compose themselves before the next wave. The UI needs some cleaner designs and added some animations to really give the game a polished look. I also integrated the ammo actually in the 3D space of the game, so the player didn't have too many things to look out for and could quickly identify their ammo count. This was from feedback that the player often ran out of ammo and didn't realise. One of the last things I did to change the game was I improved the shotgun. I changed it from a projectile based weapon to a hit scan, adding a kick to the gun and sounds and particle effects to create more impact. That was all the progress I made for this sprint, and it was time to present. However, on the day before the presentation I had crashed during taking some screenshots. After this happened, I could no longer open my file. This was only a problem because I hadn't pushed my GitHub in a few hours and had done quite a bit of work. Luckily I managed to fix the error, but it was a good lesson for me to make sure I backed up my files more often. Now this is the last sprint, however, I will still be working on the game. With the presentation I got some feedback, one of them being that a lot of the UI felt out of place as it didn't have the same post-processor materials pasted on them, making them a very different style to the rest of the game. The second, and more important, was the lack of clarity with the towers. Players kept placing the wrong tower for the situation. I think a big way to fix this will have a quick tutorial level and clearer models. One of the last things mentioned was to add a menu screen that had the controller scheme and some info for the player before they begin. Thank you for taking the time to watch. I hope you enjoy NoProbesHere when it releases.